talk this.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your took an arrow to the knee host, Madelyn.
I'm your, hello, I hate you, host Emma.
And welcome to this week's show. Here we are this mid-December Sunday talking about Emma's side quest topic. And what's more relevant to talk about than this, Emma? What's the subject?
This week we are talking about video game dialogue.
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
So
that's what we do every week.
My requisite, repeated dialogue for these side quests is, Emma, what made you choose this topic? What inspired this?
Well, I was thinking a little bit about it because Forspoken released a demo, which is the Square Enix game where she's has a talking bracelet. And they released a trailer a little bit ago that was just all the pithy quotes from the game slapped together in 30 seconds that got a really strong negative response when they released it. And so I was reading a interview and impressions of the demo, and the developers were talking about how that was a learning experience for them, that if you take all of the pithy quotes from this one character removed from their context throughout this big game, RPG size game, and put them in 30 seconds, people aren't going to like them. Because it creates this idea in people's minds that these characters are always shooting out one-liners, right? Because that's what you're sort of presenting about the game in a short amount of time. And culture has now become very anti that sort of Joss Whedon-y style of writing. Just
anti-Joss Whedon, really.
Well, anti-Joss Whedon, but also just anti that sort of, well, that happened, is the cliche way to put it. So I was thinking about that, and I also started playing the remaster of Crisis Core, and there was a review from Nintendo Insider Life or something of it, that one said Nomura's goofy dialogue, which he's not a writer on this game. He wasn't even the director of the original game. Probably had very little input on the story.
He wrote it all, Emma. Any game he's on, he bursts into the writer's room. I probably don't even have a writer's room. We'll talk about that. He bursts into the writer's room. He does the little, whiteboard conspiracy theory guy pose, and he says, "This is what the game's going to be about."
Yeah. No, but it's both the typical, we gotta throw Nomura's name around everywhere, but also sort of erasing the work of Nojima and the other writers on the game, of not giving them credit for their work. And also there was a little bit of discussion around it of are we calling Crisis Core's dialogue goofy because it's is it this just a case of the classic early 2010s Japanese games are so goofy, they talk so weird in those, when they just they talk like characters in Japanese media.
Right.
So, I mean, not that Crisis Core has some goofiness to it, but it's not every line of dialogue is incomprehensible or something, the way that some people might talk about it. So I was thinking about that a little bit as well, and I thought, why don't we talk about dialogue in games?
It was surprisingly challenging to read sort of specifically about dialogue in preparation for this episode. I don't know if you found this, that I found myself I almost started to take a lot of notes on that Boghost piece. And I was like, whoa, Madelyn. He's talking about story here. He's not talking about dialogue. Rein it in.
Dialogue is a little, it's tied to story, right? You write your dialogue around the story. So it is somewhat of a weird, specific topic. But I think that it's interesting to talk about dialogue specifically in the context of games, because in comparison to other media, there's so many different types of dialogue and places you have to put dialogue, right? You might have cutscenes that are basically like framed like movies, right? And they have movie type dialogue. But also you have dialogue when the character is just running around, or there might be dialogue while you're fighting someone, or a character might look at a specific thing and have contextual dialogue based on that. Or they might have like repeated barks that they do like in combat, like when something happens, right? That they'll say and might have to say repeatedly, which you wouldn't get like on a TV show, right? You wouldn't record the same line necessarily and have them go like, ouch, in the same inflection like 30 times throughout the course of a movie, right? So there's just like, there's a lot of places that you might need to put dialogue in a game that doesn't necessarily factor into any other thing. And that's not even touching like branching dialogues that games can have and stuff like that.
And despite all of that complexity, it was striking to me that in doing my requisite X in games Google search, where my research for all of these side quests start, right? So this week, dialogue in video games specifically, if you don't want to get a lot of like D&D stuff. So much of it was just like really basic writing advice. Somewhat tailored to video games. We can talk about the like very surface level advice. I mean, important, but surface level advice that comes up over and over and over in these things. But it was striking to me how much of this seemed geared toward like either you're making your own game and you have never written anything before in your life, and like here is how you might write some basic story and keep character motivations in mind and that sort of stuff advice. Or it was like, you want to be a games writer, here's how you break into games writing. And it was striking to me that there wasn't, I had a harder time finding anything that seemed like more specific or more like you have written something before, but you want to figure out how to write for games.
Yeah.
Kind of advice.
Yeah. Well, I think that, again, like among what we would consider like popular storytelling media, games sort of stand out from that because the job that games in like its olden form, like computer games, mostly originated from is programmers, right? Like most games, when they started out, were mostly made by people who programmed and didn't necessarily write. Obviously, there's like Colossal Cave Adventure, that like those old really text-heavy games as well.
Where's
but
the
still,
big
like
remaster of Colossal Cave Adventure? When's that coming?
We could do it, we could do it. But still, I think the primary job on a game when you're making a game are the programmers, right? The computer people. Which isn't to say computer people can't write, but that's not their job, right? So like that becomes like the primary thing, and then story becomes something that they maybe think about after the fact, right?
Definitely. But with
until The Last of Us invented narrative.
Right. I mean, storytelling in games is less than 10 years old. Storytelling in games is not even eligible to be an old game on the podcast. Yeah. Stay tuned for our 6-week recap. Whenever that is. I don't know. Our 6-week recap shortly following our year-end recap, where I talk about storytelling in The Last of Us and gripe about how I don't think it's going to be a good TV show. Put on my Boghost hat. So let me talk about, like, okay, so you're gonna write some dialogue for a video game. Here's what the internet tells me that you absolutely must keep in mind. It has to be as few words as you can possibly manage, at all times. The player does not want to listen to a word. The player would rather everyone be silent and just grunt at them. So, keep it short. Keep it short, stupid. The KISS rule for games.
Madelyn's exaggerating a little bit, I think, but there is definitely in all the advice you can find like an emphasis on being like, make sure all your dialogue, has a purpose and is being clear, and like the player is like able to glean something from it. like, immediately. Which, like, that's not, like, for writing something out, that's good to keep in mind, right? Like, if you are going through your script and you're like, oh boy, I have, like, a 20-minute section here where literally nothing happens. Maybe you're like, maybe there's some fluff in here somewhere. It's good, not to be too verbose with anything, unless, I guess that's what you're really going for. But it is very striking how much of it's like, just get to the point as quick as you can,
Well, and just how much it emphasizes, like, the player does not give a crap about this. Like, most players are going to skip this, so, like, you just got to give them what they need and get it done.
You know what? I didn't look to see if this exists. I don't think it does, but I would be really curious to get, like, some sort of statistical analysis on, like, people who skip cutscenes. Like, pick a couple of different kinds of games with various levels of narrative and, like, know how many people, like, just totally skip the story.
Yeah.
In whatever way possible.
Yeah.
I'd be super curious to know that. Like, if there are people playing, like, the God of War Ragnarok on their first time, like, skipping every cutscene. Or The Last of Us skipping every cutscene. I would be so curious how many people that is.
I mean, all of these articles make it sound like it's a solid 50%. But, like, obviously that can't be true.
I don't think that's the real.
I know.
I mean, I like the option to skip cutscenes because I can do it, like, on my second time through, or if I die to Riku for the 5th time, or whatever.
Open the door! Lead me into everlasting darkness!
That's up there with top video game dialogues.
It is. But, I mean, that is something that I noted, and I didn't really find any reading about, is I do wonder how attitudes towards, like, specifically cutscene dialogue have changed, or if they have changed, since sort of the advent of skip cutscene.
Yeah.
Like, do you think people write differently? I'm sure they do. Those cutscenes, those pre-boss cutscenes have to be longer now, and be able to be more complicated now, because they know that you won't be forcing the player to rewatch, like, a 5-minute cutscene before the boss every single time.
Yeah.
Now I'm annoyed if I have to watch, like, the boss, like, animation before I fight the boss again, if I die.
I also feel like we've just, like, gamers in general, the gaming Geitgeist. That's not how you say it.
Zeitgeist. Did you say Geitgeist?
I said Geitgeist, yeah.
The gaming Geitgeists. I like that, though, with, like, a capital G.
Is, like, friendlier to, like, long-winded things. Like, I feel like the, like, revival of Like a Dragon in the West is, like, a good like a good case study in that. Yeah. Not that, like, it's, like, super popular, but people know it, They recognize the finally it's Friday meme or whatever. And, like, those are so wordy. The opening cutscenes of Yakuza 0 are, like, half an hour long to an hour long.
Yep.
And people get through it now. And it's in a foreign language. I mean,
unless they skip it. You don't know. 75% of gamers could be skipping that.
They could be. You're right. Who knows?
You wouldn't know. No, I think, I betcha Kojima has done a lot.
For,
pioneering the long cutscene. Because you can be a gamer and appreciate the works of Hideo Kojima,
Yeah.
And I feel like that has gone a long way for being like, yes, dialogue. We can have some of that.
Yeah.
But the other tips in all of these, like, how to write for games, how to write for game stuff, feels very much like, I don't know, screenwriting or playwriting, or even just, like, acting, almost, 101. Which is what is so striking to me. I mean, I think it comes back to what you said about programming being the primary artist, I guess, primary creative in game making. Because so much of this is just like, of course you have to think about the character's motivation. Like, if you never written anything before, and plenty of people are bad writers out there in the world, of course, but it was striking to me how much of this advice was like, well, if you brought somebody into like a television writer's room, you would never, the advice for being in a TV writer's room would never be, think about the motivation of the character. Like, you know that. You got this job. Like, let's go a little higher level than that.
It is interesting for, like, really extensive RPGs. Like, think about the Witcher series, for example. Like, you have to think about Geralt's motivation in, like, side quests, right? But, like, you have to make sure it works for all stages of Geralt, where he is in the main story, right? So thinking of, like, a motivation that would cover him throughout, or making sure the character doesn't change that much, you know, so that it doesn't make sense anymore. There's no, like, Geralt corruption arc, I don't think, you know.
Alas.
So there is something there, you know, of, like, having to be, like, balancing the motivation for these, like, little side stories that, you know, a lot of players might not even engage with.
But see, that's the kind of advice that I would be interested to read. Of, okay, you're aware of this thing called character motivation. I don't have to explain that to you because you're a writer. But let's talk about how it's super, super complicated in games because, yeah, there's a lot of times where you aren't exactly sure when the player is going to engage with this particular bit of dialogue. And so you want to make sure that it makes sense, or at least doesn't actively not make sense.
Yeah.
Whenever that happens. I mean, I think, like, that's, you know, diving now into, like, okay, what actually makes games writing hard. I mean, I think that is a huge part of it. One of the things that I love the most about game dialogue is when characters will acknowledge something that has happened. Like, it's a weird example of both good and bad in Skyrim. Like, the characters in Skyrim will notice that you're, like, good at lockpicking now and make little comments about it. They make the same little comments over and over, but whatever. But they won't, like, acknowledge that you're, like, the Thane. It's like, man, I am the Thane of this area now. Like, stop bothering me about stealing. Stop being like, you smell like a wolf. Yes, I'm a werewolf. I can't figure out how to fix it. Leave me alone. So, like, those are moments of, like, really, like, exciting little dialogue things that really only games can do. Right? And that only games have to think about. And seemingly, it's a nightmare to have to think about them.
Yeah, as soon as you start getting into, like, context-specific dialogue, like, something happens and that can trigger, like, a special dialogue of some sort, it becomes more and more hard to think about. Because, like, you have to think about, one, like, how often does this thing happen? Is it worth having some sort of special reaction to it? Like, two, does it happen too much? Are we going to get people seeing the same bit of contextual dialogue, like, hundreds of times, and they're going to get sick of it and, like, make fun of it on the internet or whatever? And, like, also, like, how complicated is this to even pull off, right? Like, how specific is the situation we're thinking of, and, like, is it, then you have to test it. You have to test that it works right. You have to force yourself into that situation to make sure it's actually triggering as needed. So there's a lot of, like, there's a lot of programming in the writing of games, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's what makes games so difficult, right? Is that, I mean, you know, you can imagine, well, in the continuum of, like, okay, if I change some dialogue in a novel, like, yes, I might have to go back and edit things to make sure that my character saying that makes sense. Like, if I decide on page 200 that my character is going to say that they are from, I don't know, Gongaga, then I have to go back and make sure that they haven't said something that would suggest the contrary earlier in the book. But and then in movies, right, you can imagine, like, okay, like, there's a certain point at which you probably can't really change that because it's, like, filmed, and if you do, it has to go back, or if it's a movie that has any kind of special effects, like, it gets even more complicated in the shooting schedule and yada yada yada. And then in games, it's like, well, you have to remake the whole game when you change one word.
Yeah.
And that's an exaggeration, but, like, not that much.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, it's just weird to think about. It's weird to think about things that feel like, oh, like, that's a tiny little thing. Like, writing the line of dialogue that the character is like, oh, yeah, like, stay away from me, sneak thief, kind of line. Like, oh, that probably required, like, weeks, if not months, of work.
Probably not months of work.
I don't mean that totally. I mean, like, you know, if we're counting, like, man hours, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Like, man hour months of work to make that happen, which is crazy. How does anything happen in games?
Yeah. I mean, that's not even, like, you have to come up with an animation for those things, too.
Yep.
You know? And if it's voice acted, you have to voice act it. A lot of moving pieces you have to work with.
I do think, though, that all games probably do need to decide now, like, what are the 3 pieces of dialogue that we want to go viral on Twitter? So, like, you do have to pick... if it were me, if I were rating for a game, I'd be like, okay, we gotta pick the ones that are gonna recur just a little bit too often to get some viral marketing going.
That's one strategy for sure.
Look, it's just like, you just have to acknowledge, like, hey, it's gonna be something. There's no matter what I do, making games is too hard. Some dialogue is gonna recur too much. Let's make the choice. It's the arrow to the knee, or whatever. Control the narrative, so to speak.
I think the other kind of dialogue that's a little unique to games and interesting is anything that that's tutorialization, basically. So I read Dialogue in Video Games. It's the 2017 article that was on academia.edu.
So it's very official.
Yeah. That was talking about, like, there's diegetic communication, so dialogue that happens within the fictional world, and then ludic communication, which is directed at the player, which is, like, how do you tell the player how to play your game. And some games handle this by, like, combining these two things, right? Like, the characters will be having a diegetic conversation that is also directed at the player in a ludic conversation because they're telling them how to engage with one of their systems. Sometimes this is literally as direct as, like, press the B button to open the menu, but it's presented as a character telling another character that, and you just kind of have to roll with it. And sometimes it's like, oh, you know, these vending machines is where we can back up our data, which makes a little bit more sense in universe, but is still, like, that's for the player's benefit. Right. So being able to balance that, like, and that goes along with, like, how built in are your mechanics to the game itself as well. But, like, do you tell the player through the character, or do you just give them, like, a separate tutorial screen of some sort?
And I think, to me, the most successful way to do that is to just make a choice. Right? Sometimes, to me, it feels like games are a little bit self-conscious about telling you to press the X button.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed an Ollie Ollie World. I mean, not that the controls in Ollie Ollie World are, like, that extensive. There's not that much tutorializing, but there's more than I expected starting the game. I really appreciate that it was pretty much always, like, a character would be like, here's how you, like, do a kickflip. And then, like, Big Mike would be like, in other words, press X. Or he's like, or I call it rotating the analog stick.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, Mike, what? So in that choice, I was like, yes, the game made a clear choice here, and I like it.
Yeah.
And that obviously wouldn't work in many, many, many games. Like, Ollie Ollie
Yeah.
World is silly enough that it can do it that way. But I just appreciate when it's like, you know what, we're gonna like decide how we're doing this, and we're gonna stick to that, as opposed to it being like a weird mishmash of tutorial screens or characters telling you things or that sort of thing. But it is tricky. Like, you don't have to have, like, the Spy Kids tell you how to put on your 3D glasses if you're going to the movies. Like,
They probably did that, actually.
They probably did, but it wasn't, like...
Not within the movie.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You don't have to have like Nicole Kidman tell you how to sit
That's
down
what they
and buy
should
your
do.
popcorn.
That's what they should do for tutorials. I want Clive Final Fantasy 16 to have like an intro movie where he like holds a controller and like walks me through the buttons. That's what I want. You know?
That would be cool. The problem, though, is that they have to teach, like, they're not going to give you all the controls at the beginning. That's the only problem.
Whatever.
We could just cut back and forth. We'd be just like, hey, Clyde Final Fantasy here. I feel like there's an opportunity for that with Kingdom Hearts 4. I'm just throwing that out there now. That, like, we can have Sora play a Kingdom Hearts-like game on his television, and people can teach him the controls, and they're the same controls.
I think that's good.
I'm giving away ideas for free here.
Yeah.
I have learned everything there is to learn about writing game dialogue over the past several hours. Namely, few words, motivation. Sometimes there need to be tutorials. So, I'm the expert. It is sort of shocking that game stories come together in a way that's coherent at all, given... I was trying to research, like, how does game dialogue get written? And once again, I just want someone to be like, here's how it happens. But there was so much stuff that was like, the writer's room. What an idea.
Yeah, I think the issue is just there isn't currently, like, a standardized way that writing happens in games. Either at the AAA level or the indie level. There's just not like a format for it, really. Even like tools for it, like when you have like branching structures, like eventually you have to be writing that in some sort of fashion that is easy to follow, right?
It was shocking to me how many articles we read that was like, somebody spent 8 months building a system so we could even write our dialogue.
Yeah. A lot of people have in-house dialogue systems. The Night in the Woods people made Yarn that they made open source afterwards. That's probably the most robust system that's open source out there. There's also Inkle, which I believe works with a few less things than Yarn does. You might just use Google Sheets. But it's a matter of, like, even, like, having, like, writers on the team, right? Like, so that might not be as familiar with, like, coding, right? So you want to have a system that's friendly for writing in, but still able to, like, deal with the programmatic elements of a branching dialogue system.
Yeah.
Which means putting in a lot of upfront work to actually make that system for your writer so that they can then do their work with minimal trouble.
Even Naughty Dog was hiring writers for the first time. Naughty Dog, the inventors of narrative.
Yeah.
Which I know that studio operated just like absolutely like the Wild West until a couple years ago. But I don't even mean that in the like crunch way. It just seems to be like, did anyone have a job title? Unclear.
Yeah.
But it's like shocking that the studio that's like they made the story game, like it didn't have like someone whose job was writer.
Yeah.
So the fact that so many games come together with just like, even in games that have like writer's room type things, like I can't imagine that the way TV episodes get written, and I know this is not the case because I work with TV writers at work. I am not a television producer, but I work with people who are TV producers and write for TV. And I know that the way those episodes come together is not like, you're going to write minutes 1 through 3, you're going to write minutes 3 through 6, you're going to write minute 7, and also minute 14 through 15. And that seems to be how games get written. It's like, it's unbelievable that anybody has a character that has a through line through any game.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's in some ways it makes sense, right? Like, you might have someone writing, like, codex entries, and, like, that's their job, you know, or item descriptions. Or you might have a separate team doing side quests than you do on the main story, which, like, theoretically, if you think about it, like, yeah, that makes sense. But you also end up sometimes with, like, very disconnected side quests from the main story. Because, I guess, not enough communication between the people writing this.
Well, I think about, and this is, more localization than dialogue, but some article I read about Like a Dragon at some point, and I think this is the guy who's someone who's since left the studio, but, like, talking about how, like, he's the Majima guy, and if he got hit by a bus, like, they'd be in trouble because nobody else can quite hit the tone.
Writing for certain characters too. Yeah,
and that's wild. That's wild that's how dialogue writing gets done on games. Like, imagine. I guess on, like, certain, like, kind of, like, sketch type shows, maybe this would work. But imagine if it was like, like, the writers' room of The Office, just, like, they each wrote for one character, and, like, they all, like, brought in that dialogue and, like, squished it together.
You don't think that the writers wrote for their own characters?
I mean, I'm sure that they did, and that's why I picked that show. But, like, even for a show where people were, like, literally playing sort of lightly fictionalized versions of themselves, it still doesn't feel like, like, Mindy wrote her Mindy dialogue, and BJ Novak wrote the Ryan dialogue, and then they, like, came together. Like,
yeah.
I'm sure that's not how it worked, and it's wild to think about that in games being, like, even partially how it works. That's wild. Who's the person who wrote the dialogue for the shopkeepers in Fire Emblem Three Houses? I want to have a word with that person. I don't know, but they're God. Speaking of repeated dialogue. You have a good eye. You have a pleasure doing business. You have a good eye. A pleasure doing business.
This one? This one? This one?
I thank you.
I thank you.
Speaking of Fire Emblem Three Houses, let's talk about another pitfall of game dialogue writing. The NPC wall.
Yeah. I thought this was an interesting point of, this is especially prevalent in RPGs, and, like, RPGs is probably the genre of game that isn't, like, a VN or whatever, that it's always going to have the most dialogue, like, period. So there's that, but, you probably have towns in RPGs, right? But you also travel between towns, so you're going to get this situation where, like, you've just, like, been on your own for, like, an hour, and then you come to a new town, and, like, there's, like, 50 to 100 NPCs that could all possibly talk to you and tell you something. And, like, you don't have to interact with those NPCs, but our completionist impulses tell us we must. We must discuss with these NPCs. And you end up, like, stuck in this town for a very long time, chatting to everybody.
Well, it's one of those big game design issues that just doesn't have an easy way to solve. Like, I think of, similarly, not in dialogue, but in just design. You've got, like, two pathways in front of you. The player always wants to find the optional one first.
Yeah.
Right? So they can get the loot and then go around to the story when they don't want to have to double back. And I feel like the wall of NPCs is sort of the same idea, that when you get to a town, you don't necessarily know who the important NPCs are. Or if you do, we get to gripe on the other end of things about, like, oh, the minimap has so many indicators, and I just want to discover things on my own.
Yeah.
So there's, pros and cons to each. You don't know who's important. You don't know who, even who, if they aren't important, are, like, interesting or might say something different if you talk to them now and you come back and you talk to them again later. You might not even know if you're going to come back to this town. So you have to talk to everybody now just in case somebody has, like, the sword of destruction that they want to give to you because you talk to them in the corner, like, left square of the town. Right? I think it comes down to that there's no, like, when you think about it, right, your character would have no motivation to talk to literally everyone they encounter in a town.
Well, it depends on what the context is, but yeah.
Okay, in most situation.
There is some JRPG protagonists where I'm like, oh yeah, they would talk to literally everybody they saw in this new town.
I'll give that caveat. Like, yes, there are certain characters who have that personality, or there might be certain situations where you're like looking for someone or something where you would want to talk to everyone. But most of the time, entering a town, you wouldn't like be like, yes, I must enter every building and talk to every person in this town before I go to sleep at the inn and start my next day. And it's just one of those, again, it's like a really tricky storytelling thing and a really tricky dialogue design thing, because everyone is going to go around and do this in like one go. Yeah. But like that's definitely not the way that dialogue is probably best like experienced.
One way to I think that the approach that some games are taking now, but like Final Fantasy X Remake is a good example, I think. They don't really they have a couple of NPCs that you can talk to, usually because they have some sort of task for you, but mostly you're just walking around and there's like a absurd amount of people talking around you that you can like overhear, which like makes more sense.
Definitely.
Theoretically. You can get a lot of information that way, but you're not necessarily like stopping and talking to everybody. You're just overhearing them talking to each other. But obviously also has its own pitfalls of like, oh god, there's a lot of people talking. There's like that first, like Tifa's walking you through the town to take you to your apartment, Cloud, and like they're talking, but also you're walking by like a ton of people, and just like the little scroller bar on the side is like going through like 5 different conversations that you cannot possibly hope to keep up with while also paying attention to what Cloud and Tifa are saying. So you do run into a problem when you have something like that, of like you're asking a lot of the players, not attention span, but just ability to focus, right? Of any person's ability to focus on multiple things at once.
That's true. I still think overall that system is probably more effective. It's just easier to pick out, like, oh, that might be an important conversation, or at least one that interests me, as opposed to, there's a dude standing here. I wonder if he has something important to say.
Yeah. It does also create more work, I think, for the writer this way, though. Because you have to come up with more stuff and also have, like, conversations between, like, distinct NPC characters. Like, you don't have to, like, flesh out these things, but the people talking have to have, like, a personality, that they're talking to another personality rather than just talking to your main character with whatever happens to be relevant, right?
I'm going to come back to the scope challenges of it, but I just want to continue the, like, wall of NPCs conversation for a moment. It's, and talking about Fire Emblem specifically here, Fire Emblem sort of has this problem. Like, Fire Emblem Three Houses is very much what people like about it is the character stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So it's weird for me to jump in and be like, actually, it's kind of rough the way this dialogue is presented, because Fire Emblem Three Houses is like wall of NPCs the game.
Well, it's interesting because while we play it this way, and I think a lot of people do, I don't think the intended way to play it is to like recruit every character.
I agree with that, but this is another place where I want statistics.
Those might actually exist. They do, if you turn on online on Three Houses, they give you statistics for certain things, like who was recruited that month, who was talked to that month. Yeah, but that doesn't give me enough information. Yeah, but you'll see, like, if you're on that path, like, and you're in the time skip, you'll see, like, oh, people on Golden Deer seem to have had tea mostly with Golden Deer students this month. And you might also see, like, Dorothea.
Right. Yes, Dorothea was the top of, like, all of them. My boyfriend was playing.
Yeah.
And fair, that's fair. I still want the deets on, like, what percentage of players. Because I feel like, alright, yes, you're right. Not everyone is recruiting everyone, because they aren't freaks about it like we are. But, okay, percentage of players are, and probably most players are recruiting, like, at least 4 or 5 other students.
Sure.
I I think more...
But I do think that makes a big difference. That's all I'm saying.
I agree. But what I'm saying is there's part of it though, like there is the like every month there's a new wall of NPCs. So like there's that, which is in itself like it's a lot of running around. Like I wish there was a way that you could space out your running around and having your dialogue moment with the students throughout the month. But you can't because
Fishing.
What?
Fishing.
Fishing?
You take your fishing break.
That's true. I guess. You have a limited amount of fishing you can do at the beginning, though.
That's true.
But also then the supports, which are the highlight of the game. But even when you have to watch, like, 4 of them in a row, it's like, oh, this is too many.
I would actually, like, some of that I blame on the music. There's only, like, 3 pieces of music that they have for support conversations, and when you hit A, it is that violin piece every single time.
Yeah.
Like the sort of sad, like wistful one.
Oh, it is, yeah.
For every single A support. And so when you're hitting the end of the game and you have like 5 A supports in a row, you're like, oh god, this
to
music
me, I think
again.
The big problem with the dialogue there, though, is the necessary redundancy. Like, I think there are just too many supports, is my hot take.
And this is way toned down from Awakening and Fates. It's worth pointing out.
I know. But what I'm saying is, there's only so many times, spoilers, I guess, for 3 Houses, that I can watch Lysithea reveal that, like, her crusts are going to kill her.
Well, you would know better. I only remember her revealing that, like, twice.
Okay, but... I mean, fair enough. It's like, I feel like my point still stands. That, like, there are some story beats that are revealed sort of over and over and over again. And it's like, sure. Yes, we all know. And so sometimes, you know, again, it's just that struggle with, like, when is the player going to encounter certain dialogue? You don't know.
Yeah.
And so you have to build in so much redundancy to make sure they get the key information that it can sometimes be frustrating. Anyway, as promised, I'll now move to the games cost money portion.
It's shocking.
So Emma and I are over here being like, nah, like you gotta have custom dialogue for a bunch of different situations, and the people gotta be chatting in the background. That's the ideal way to do it. And you can't have a wall of NPCs, so you want to make sure it's like important ones, but like maybe they have different things to say over time. And games are free and easy to make, so yeah, that's doable for everyone.
Yeah. It's okay, I'd also like them to be short, so it balances out.
You're right. Yeah.
I only need to make like 10 hours of this. It's fine.
But yeah, if you keep reading about game dialogue, so much of it is about the idea of like, well, if we add more of this, like Emma said earlier, you have to do the animation, and you have to do the lip sync, and you have to do it in all the languages that your game is going to be in. It has to be recorded, and like if there's dialogue options, you have to figure out how that works. And so even just adding in like one little line of dialogue can create exponential work. And so you're constantly on games having to decide where is your money going, and maybe even more importantly than that, where is your time going? Which is easy to forget.
It's all about, like, you come up with ideas, and then for each idea, you have to take your guesstimate on, like, how much time will this take, and how much will players actually appreciate it, you know? Like, will they think this is cool? Will they even understand what is happening? Like, or will they totally ignore it? And is that okay? Do we think that it's still worth putting in because people would complain if it wasn't there, you know? So it's all about, like, making those kind of calculations before you actually go in and start doing the work for it.
That has been Games Cost Money.
Yeah. A few other unique things to games I sort of wanted to cover is games might or might not have voice acting, right? Typically... And books, I guess, are sort of an exception to this because you might have an audiobook down the line. But typically, you'll know when you're writing a book or creating a movie, like, okay, this is voice acted. or this is not voice acted, right?
Yeah.
Like, with obvious exceptions, like accessibility stuff or whatever. You'll be like, but generally, you're like, the general public, most people consuming this will either have it voice acted or not voice acted. Whereas some games will be able to have voice acting and some games will not. So you don't really know what you're getting in a game until you start playing it, right? Or maybe it's partially voice acted, right? Maybe characters have barks that they play. Like they have like little phrases that play over top of a line that's totally different from it, you know, like that they repeat. Just to like remind you what their voice sounds like or whatever. Maybe someone will turn on the Japanese voice acting versus the English voice acting. There's that too. And I think that the way you would write for something that isn't voice acted is different than the way you would write for something that is voice acted a lot of the time. I was thinking about this because, like I said, I'm playing the remaster of Crisis Core that is now fully voice acted when it used to have a lot of lines that weren't. And, like, I can tell a little bit. Like, they haven't changed the script beyond a couple of lines that were just wrong in the original as far as the localization goes. Mm-hmm. And I like, when they read the lines, I'm like, these were not voice acted. The voice actors have no idea how to handle this.
Can you get into the details of that a little more? Because I'll admit when I think about that, I'm like, well, would voice acted lines be shorter or longer? Or is like a different style?
I think it's just, you think more about how they sound out loud.
Yeah.
Basically. Like sometimes in books you get to a line and you're not thinking about it. If you try to read it out loud, you're like, that sounds a little weird. It's not that they're bad lines of dialogue, right? I don't think so anyway. It's just like you're not thinking about how it sounds when someone says it.
Yeah.
And there might be like a more natural phrase of words that someone might actually use if they were saying it out loud. Crisis Core also has this, like, when they're unvoiced, there are like these weird pauses of dialogue, pauses in between lines where like the player might still be processing what they read. But that's, like, maintained in this version because they're still using the old animations. So there'll be, like, these weird pauses, like, small pauses between them finishing their lines when it was previously unvoice acted, which creates this weird little awkwardness as well.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. It's sort of charming in its own way. I'm like, PSP.
Another time.
Another time. Or, you know, like, even, like, you might be more, like, poetic when it's not voice acted.
Yeah.
So it sort of depends on the tone of it as well. The other thing that I think is interesting is, like, presentation. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about, like, Oxenfree and, like, Night in the Woods have this style where there are characters on the screen, and when they talk, they have, like, little speech bubbles, like comics that come off of them. Like, little tiny ones. And that style of, like, dialogue presentation is inherently going to be different writing it than, like, if you're, like, Fire Emblem Three Houses, which has a more typical VN presentation, like, visual novel style when characters are talking to each other, right? They have their portrait and just the full text that they're saying at the bottom of the screen in a little text box. So, like, when you have that, you can create things that are a little bit longer or more complicated, right? Because you can see it and process it all at once. Whereas if you have little bubbles, that's more conducive to, like, short phrases, characters talking over each other, slightly more, like, pithy stuff happening.
Yeah.
You know? And that's down to the way that the UI is presented, right? You wouldn't really want to... I think it would be odd to create something where, like, someone is talking about really complicated things with, like, a little cute little speech bubble over it. But it would also really be odd in, like, more typical VN style if you're trying to have two characters talk at once. It would be difficult to do that with the UI. So just the way that you present dialogue in games puts restrictions or encouragements on how the writer approaches actually writing it, which I think also is interesting.
Well, that's why I thought it was sort of interesting that Oxenfree came up in so many articles as like, here's game dialogue done right, and you should emulate this kind of thing. It's like, yes, absolutely. The game is dialogue. Oxenfree's game is dialogue, pretty much, right? Like,
yeah.
So, on one hand, yeah, the dialogue better be good, and it is the way you can interact with it much more naturalistic than the way you can interact with dialogue in most other games. I don't mean to say this to like denigrate Oxenfree. It's really good at what it does, but it's also like you're not going to be able to emulate that in your like action adventure game. It would be weird if you did.
Yeah,
it wouldn't work. You wouldn't want those little bubbles. Like maybe you want to emulate the like they sound like humans kind of writing of it, but
there's also just the ease of picking choices in Oxenfree. Like it's pretty easy to choose it, which means you can walk and talk at the same time, right? But depending on what you're doing, other games it might be harder to have like walk and talk choice-based dialogue that's like timed, you know. It might really be like, this is too much happening at once here. I'm trying to fight an orc or whatever.
We haven't really talked even about choice-based dialogue and how hard that is, too, here.
I mean, I think we covered it, yeah. It's a similar difficulty as, like, contextual dialogue. You have to think about the cost-benefit of it. Like, if you cannot make a conversation that is as free-flowing as a conversation in reality, right? And if you are probably unable to, like, I think one of the articles, it might have been about Oxenfree, is like, if the designer can no longer follow the conversation they're working on, it's probably too complicated. So they talk about, like, you have to limit the amount of choices that you can have, right? Like, you can't just say anything, like you can in reality. And also, it's important to have, like, choke points where it returns back to the middle, if it's, like, and then proceeds outward again, right? So points where you come back and hit like an important plot point or whatever, and then you can expand back out again. But you can't just keep like, you can't start from one and then it's just like a branching graph. Like if you try to do that over like any sort of significant length of game, it would be pretty much impossible.
Well, but I have to give my one dialogue choice is gripe, which is when I pick a dialogue choice and the character interprets it differently than I did and they say something rude.
I don't think that happens as much anymore, but I don't actually play a ton of choice-based things, I don't think.
I can't remember when
I did think it was interesting.
It just stuck with, it has stuck with me as an experience the few times it has happened.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was reading the academia.edu article I read was like the amount of specificity that's important can be dependent on like the type of game you're playing, right? So they use the example of like if you're playing a dating sim, you probably want to know exactly what your character is going to say because those are all about like the emotional impact of the words that you're saying, right? About like emotionally connecting with the characters. Whereas if you're playing, like, something more tactical, maybe you would just want to have, like, ask more, you know, or dismiss, or, like, compliment, or whatever. Like, maybe you don't need to know exactly what they would say as long as you get the general gist of, like, what you're doing, right? Like, oh, I want to know more about this, so I can hit ask more, and then my character will be like, hey, what are you talking about, you know? But you don't have to put, like, what are you talking about as the dialogue choice. So I thought that was interesting in terms of like player goals and game goals, you know? Like how much detail do you need to have there in order to make it clear to the player what they're doing?
Well, for me, sometimes more. More detail.
The problem with that, and I think why it ends up shortening it, is because the line they might have written for the player is like longer.
Oh.
And it's not going to look good on a choice wheel.
I'm not asking for the entire line on the choice wheel. Just sometimes the descriptor could be interpreted in too many different ways.
I joked that they should use tone indicators on there.
Bring it on.
Like admonish/J.
Here's the problem. I don't know what those mean. There's a
You don't know what
/J
means?
I assume /J is joking, but that is just a guess.
Yeah, it is. Great. /Sus.
What?
/Sus.
They should just
SRS.
only do those, because then I won't even be, like, I can't even think about it anymore. I'll just pick a random string of letters. Alright, well, I'm going to close with objectively the worst dialogue in a video game of all time, officially.
I didn't think that this was that bad.
I didn't either. But it's in the Guinness Book of World Records, so here it is. The world record game line, worst dialogue ever in a game from Resident Evil. First one. Wait. It says 2002. Oh, I see. It was voted in 2002. From Resident Evil, released in 1996, here's the line. Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you. So there it is.
Like, it's not great. But also it's funny. So, like, whatever, you know?
I know. But Guinness has spoken.
I guess so. Very, very official Guinness Book of World Records.
They're a beer company, so they know what they're talking about.
Exactly.
Well, listeners, what would you give the world record for worst line of dialogue in a video game? Do you want tone indicators on your dialogue choice wheels? Do you enjoy the wall of NPCs? I want somebody to come and defend the wall of NPCs for us.
You know what? I'll say, in Cold Steel, one of the things I really like about Cold Steel is, like, going through the NPCs in your home base city and talking to everyone there in between chapters. Not necessarily, like, they have wall of NPCs where, like, you're in a new city and I'm like, oh god, there's a lot of people here. But then, like, you go back to home base and you're like, oh yeah, my witch friend.
Emma just did it. Emma just defended the wall of NPCs. Do you wish that more game writers took basic, like, scene study acting classes before doing writing for games? If you have thoughts about any of this or anything else that we discussed, that we dialogued about this episode on Dialogue, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in our hat for our main editions, and read our blog, featuring long-running series Split Screen and Clickbait Boyfriend. And finally, if you enjoy the show and you want to listen to our dialogue every week on Sundays, you can subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. Subscribe to Talk This.
Heck yeah.
Next week it's Christmas. Some very holiday-themed games.
Yep, it was Triangle Strategy and Hotline Miami.
Right. Should I play Triangle Strategy while you're home? Do you have Triangle Strategy?
Oh yeah, I could bring it home for you.
Please do.
Okay.
Excellent. Right, because the triangle, we were like the Trinity. Ha ha ha.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the week after that, it'll be New Year's Eve. Actually, it'll be New Year's Day. I know how days work. And it'll be our year-end game and review.
Yep.
And then after that, it'll be, 6 weeks in gaming? That can't be right.
7 weeks.
Maybe we should do a main quest, though.
Well, I mean, we don't want to spend the whole year review one talking about, like, our last 7 weeks in gaming, I don't think.
Listeners, Emma and I will take this conversation offline. This is isn't this the dialogue that everybody wants right here? The behind-the-scenes dialogue?
They want to know what's happening. The player must know at all times what is happening.
What is the quest? What am I going to kill?
You do wrap this up by telling them exactly what they need to do, which is subscribe to the podcast.
And then you wrap it up by telling them exactly what we wish for them.
which is to have some lovely family dialogues over the holidays.